Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to cut your skirt pattern or block. So I have gone ahead to fold my fabric into two before I placed my pattern on top. Right now what I'm doing is placing my paper pattern on top the folded edge of my fabric, and that is the center front. So I'm laying my center front pattern on top the center front of my fabric. Then I'm pinning round it. Then the next thing I'm going to do is to trace all around my skirt block. After tracing around my skirt block, I added seam allowances to the side. So at the side, I added about 5 cm. Then I connected the lines. So I'm just going to use my hip curve ruler now to connect the lines from the top to the bottom. Now at the top, I added about 1.5 cm and I connected with a straight line. At the hem, I added about 5 cm also. So at the side of the hem, I did like an extra 1.5 cm just to give it like a triangle shape so that when I cut it, the skirt can lap. Now to do the back pattern, I'm measuring about 15 cm just to get a straight line. And this 15 cm mark is where I will place my pattern from so that I can get an accurate line when I cut out my skirt block or skirt pattern. Then I'm using my self-healing mat or my cutting mat as a guide for me to get my straight line since I cannot rely on my fabric. And remember I said my fabric is folded in half. So now I'm just connecting those parts I have marked with a straight line. And I am confirming if the hem of my skirt is straight, because remember that in previous video I folded the skirt length. So I'm just confirming that, and I'm placing my skirt pattern beginning from that line. So the next thing I did was to put some weight on top my pattern. Then I traced around my pattern, making sure that I highlight all the sides. That's where I have like my hip, my midline, my waist, to make sure that when I'm sewing, those lines can align or meet properly. So at the side back, I'm adding 5 cm just like the way I added for the front. Then I connected the lines using my hip curve ruler. The next thing I did was to connect the lines. Then I'm going to mark out or highlight all the areas that have the label, like the upper hip, the midline, and the rest. Then I'm going to add my seam allowances at the center back line or at the center back area. So I'm going to mark out my slit, how wide I want my slit to be. Slit usually depends on your availability of material. So I'm marking mine 8 cm, but if my fabric was longer in terms of length, I can also use 8 cm, but it means the length of my slit will be longer. But since I'm working with a short fabric, my slit is short. So after marking out, I'm going to add 1.5 cm just above the slit. This is going to serve as my seam allowance. Now I'm just making sure all my points connect, and I'm using my curve ruler to make it more visible. After that, I'm going to cut out those areas that I've marked out, just as you're seeing. After cutting out, I'm just recreating my dart line at the back. So just as it is on the paper, I'm marking it out and making sure that it's replicated on the fabric. Now I've put my lining on fold and I'm placing my pattern on it. You can decide to place your skirt on it. That's your main skirt fabric on it that you've cut out to serve as a pattern, or you can decide to use your paper pattern. It does not really matter, but I'm just recreating the exact replica of my skirt, but it's up to you to decide. I don't know why I decided to go through this longer route, but it's quicker for you to just place your skirt pattern on top. That's what you've already cut out as a fabric, instead of going through the process of starting afresh using your paper pattern. Anyway, so I'm just marking out my lining, and I'm just going to repeat the same process on the lining. Is it needed? After creating the front pattern, we're going to just mark out a line and use it as a guide to help us place our back fabric correctly, just so that it can be straight when we're placing it. So this is just a straight line I'm drawing to enable me place the pattern, and we're just going to repeat the same process like we did with the fabric. So adding all the same allowances and making sure that we put a label on each side, because for instance you can see that the center back and the side back are having almost the same shape, so you need to like put a label there. And after you finish putting the label, add your seam allowances and your slits, just like the way the fabric itself had slits. The main reason why I'm just using the lining is just because I realized that the skirts fabric, that's the red and black fabric, was not showing the lines like the way the lining is as I'm marking. So that's just why I repeated it. But after we finish adding all our allowances, then we can cut out and begin to sew. After marking and cutting out, please do not forget to replicate your dart. If not, you find out that after sewing, one fabric is going to be smaller or bigger than the other. That's your lining may be bigger or your actual fabric may be bigger. That is if you forget to replicate your dart on your fabric and your lining. So make sure you do that as you cut or once you finish cutting. So after cutting, this is all our pieces for the back and for the front. Now we're going to reduce the hem of the lining by 1.5 cm, just so that when we sew the hem, it's going to give it a neat finish. You don't want the lining pushing out of the skirt. Now we're going to place both pieces of our back lining and fabric together, and we're going to put it on gather stitch and sew it, just so that we can have our seam line on where we want to fix our zip and where our slit should be, because you want it to be exact. After sewing, make sure you iron. After sewing all pieces of your back pattern together, you are going to loosen it and sew right side to right side of only your fabric and right side to right side of only your lining using regular stitch, not loose stitch anymore. And after you're done, iron again. Then insert your zip. After inserting your zipper, I usually use about 23 cm, depending on how full the person's butt is. But insert your zipper, and after inserting your zipper, you're going to place your fabric for the front and for the back, right side to right side, facing each other. Now that we've placed our front piece and back piece together, right side to right side, we're going to sew on each side seam for the fabric and for the lining. So you can see that I'm pinning, so you want to make sure you're sewing along the pin line for both your lining and your fabric, but just make sure that your lining, you're not sewing exactly on the line. So you want your lining to be slightly bigger than your actual fabric, so that the lining does not pull on the fabric. So if, for instance, you sew exactly on 2.5 cm on your fabric, you want to sew on 2 cm or even 1.5 cm on your lining. The bottom line is that your lining should just be slightly bigger than your fabric. After you finish sewing, just press again with iron. After sewing the pieces together, I'm pressing again with the iron. So you cannot escape ironing when you're sewing, because ironing makes it have a smooth finish. So after ironing, I'm going to loosen my slit, because at my slit area, what I have there is just a loose stitch. So it's not a permanent stitch, that is not regular stitch, it's just a gathered stitch that I used there. But I made sure I back stitch at where the slit stopped, both for the lining and for the fabric. So I'm just loosening the stitch. So after loosening it, I'm going to mark out my sewing line, just so that it's easy for me to see what I'm doing. So I'm marking about 1.5 cm, which we marked originally, but I'm remarking it so that it's easy for me to see it when I'm sewing. So that's my slit stop there that I backstitch. So you want to make sure you stitch that place so that it doesn't lose. Then you're going to create like an L shape, which is where your seam allowance stops. And I'm going to repeat the same thing for the fabric. So I've done that for the lining and I'm doing that for the fabric. And you want to make sure when you're losing the slit area, you're loosening both the fabric and the lining. Now I'm going to sew along that area and stop at my slit stop mark. So you backstitch that area when you're done. Don't forget to notch so that the fabric at that area can relax. Now I'm going to sew the waist of my skirt together. That's the waist of my lining and my fabric. I'm going to sew it together, and I placed hemming gum on it, just so that the waist can be crisp when I'm done sewing. So after sewing, this is what it looks like. So I'm going to turn it back inside out and sew along the zip. But please, I would advise that when you're doing yours, do not sew the zip area yet. Sew the hem of the skirt first. So after the waist, you sew the hem, or you sew the hem, then you sew the waist. But do not sew the zipper area, because it was not easy for me doing that. It may be easy for some people, but I didn't find it funny doing the waist and the zipper at the same time. So please, after the waist, just go straight to the hem. Now I'm marking the middle of the hem of the lining and the middle of the hem of the skirt, and I'm putting them right side to right side. I'll also go ahead to add fusible interfacing or hemming gum, just so that the hem can be smooth instead of having that puffy look. I like it to be firm and smooth. So I'm just going to pin the hemming gum around it, and I'm going to sew from one end to the other end. After sewing, I'm going to loosen about 10 cm on one part of the lining, that's just on the side of the lining, to enable me turn the fabric inside out. After sewing, I turn the fabric out, and I realized that I forgot to stitch one part of the slit. So I put my hand through the opening in the lining and went in and stitched it together. So after stitching, you want to make sure that everything is smooth, and you want to put the slit or the excess or the overlap of the slit to one direction of the skirt. So this is what the slit looks like, and I'm just going to carefully arrange it and put it to one side of the skirt. Now you can decide to use a hemming gum to finish that opening you have, or you can decide to go to the sewing machine and stitch that opening you have on the lining back together. Now I'm carefully using a tweezer to push through the bulk of fabric I have at the tip of the hem. So you want to be careful when you're doing this. You can use a tweezer, a pencil, a scissors, any sharp object you have, but just be careful so that you don't poke hole through your fabric. Now I am ironing the waist, and I'm carefully arranging the waist as I'm pressing on it, because you know there's hemming gum on the waist and the hem, and you don't want a situation whereby you're just randomly putting your iron and it's sticking and it's not smooth. So you're going to begin ironing from the waist and carefully pushing the excess of the fabric to the hem, and you are going to gradually place the iron from the waist towards the hem, but make sure that the excess fabric has got into the hem before you press the hem. After pressing the hem, I'm just going to make a slanted line at the slit area. Remember, like I said, if my skirt was longer, the length of my slit will be longer. So now I'm going to sew across that slit line, but making sure that all the bulk of my fabric are facing one direction. And now I'm finishing the lining with hemming gum, and this is the final look of my skirt.